Welcome to DM the PM podcast, where we cut through the noise of product jargon to deliver actionable step-by-step insights from industry practitioners, helping founders and product leaders turn complex concepts into clear, practical strategies you can apply today. And in order to achieve that, the podcast is split into 4 different sections. The first one is an intro, where we learn a bit more about our guest. The second is around going deep into the most asked questions about the topic, followed by a mythbuster, where we discuss the main things that people tend to get wrong about the topic. And we finish off with something called the threshold concept, where we ask the guest to break down the absolute essentials, the minimum you need to know to really excel at the topic. Hi, I'm Diana. I'm your podcast host. I'm a product coach and consultant. I help B2C product teams validate ideas early, translate customer needs into valuable features to reduce waste and boost market success. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Jake Barnett, founder of Day One Data, your external marketing analytics team. I have known Jake for years, since our time at Tesco, and I have been able to see him drive huge impact in Tesco and in Farfetch, specifically around being a product leader in data. And now he made the leap into setting up his own consulting business. And today we'll dive deep into topics of data foundations and marketing analytics. So thank you so much for being here. Can you please tell everyone a bit more about your background and your journey into founding a marketing data consultancy?
Sure. Thanks for having me, first and foremost. And yeah, I guess to start at the beginning of my professional working career, I started off at Tesco, where Diana and I both worked as product managers. And back then I was working in a team called Analytics Capability. So that was effectively satisfying all the different business domains, units, stores, actually, with product we co-supported together to have the data that they had available so they could make impactful and actionable decisions. After being at Tesco for around 2 years, I moved to a company called Farfetch, which is a luxury e-commerce marketplace. And at Farfetch, I became a principal product manager looking after customer data foundations. So within customer data foundations, I effectively look after everything with a 3-letter abbreviation. So from marketing mix modeling, MMM, to single customer views, to customer data platforms, that was pretty much my domain. So Farfetch had a pretty substantial marketing budget. And it was my job to come up with the data products to help spend that in the most incremental way, and to also refine our customer proposition to ensure that we were delivering personalized experiences and messaging to our new and existing customer base. I always wanted to start a business, and I've had the advice before, it's like, do what you know. And data products and data development was something which I knew. So the natural step for me was to start my own data consultancy. And that was really the genesis of Day One Data. And we've been around for 6 months or so now. And we do 2 main things, so data foundations and marketing analytics. And within that, we've worked with a pretty industry agnostic group of accounts. So anything from B2B SaaS to marketplaces to food and bev to fintech. It doesn't really necessarily matter to us, provided, there's a need for data support, they haven't got it, or if there's an internal gap for some kind of expertise that we have, which maybe they don't already have internally. So for example, econometrics. And yeah, very much so excited to be here talking to you today.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, that is actually quite a good point around the fact that you can apply all these skills industry agnostic. And we'll definitely dive deeper into understanding how.
Yeah.
And I guess what motivated you? I know you have obviously the experience in doing what you do best, but is there any other motivation behind focusing on marketing data analytics?
I mean, as Afa mentioned, marketing was always an area in which I've personally had expertise in, and so have like the founding partners of Day One Data as well. So I guess our expertise led us to this place of having a marketing analytics focus. But on the flip side, I think there's two other reasons. So one, the marketing domain is quite actionable. So for example, like there's a spend, there's a return. How do you measure the impact of something? How do you come up with like an optimization or scenario where you can measure the tangible result of your action? So that sometimes, which is a little bit, let's say, lacking within data products, is the ability to like measure what you've actually achieved and prove the impacts. It's an area where we believe that's very much possible. And the second point is around the marketing nuances. When you actually get into the marketing tech of understanding ad platforms, attribution, experimentation, incrementality techniques, understanding even just data definitions and the calculations, it's quite a nuanced domain, which is where we find there's sometimes internal gaps or opportunities to expand this knowledge.
That's a very good point. You definitely have this kind of like black hole that everyone knows that in order to grow, you have to invest in marketing, and marketing is always one of the biggest spend for a company. And there's a lot of, I guess, maths behind it. You're right. It's like there's so much attribution and last click attribution. There's so many different versions to measure the success of it, but it's actually quite hard to get right and to set up the optimizations for it.
Yeah. I mean, there's two worlds of marketing, right? You've got the one hand, which is really performance driven and metric dominated. And then you've got the other hand, which is very creative and, brand equity focused, which is more to do with like, awareness for your brand and preference and consideration. So what we try and do is to support marketing teams and CMOs within that intersection, to help to justify / quantify / validate, that brand side of things and tie that back into like the incremental impact on the performance spend. And I guess that's kind of the whole school of econometrics really. But nowadays, with the world being what it is, with inflation rates increasing and the macroeconomy being a bit, let's say, all over the place, justifying spend or activity, regardless if it's brand or performance, has never been more paramount. So what we try and do is just act as like a support function for marketing teams, or in fact, the wider business teams, to hit their stated business objectives and to help to validate and de-risk their growth strategies.
What are some of the like common gaps? Where do you see that, regardless of the industry, there's like places where actually knowledge, tools or products are required? Are there any things that tend to be the same across different companies?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, when you think about things really upstream, within MarTech, you're typically looking into leveraging softwares for user tracking, right? And setting up these softwares is quite a tricky process. So that's like the tagging, the tracking of the user journey. So this is one area that we typically find, especially smaller businesses haven't necessarily cracked their tracking. And then you have experimentation. So lots of businesses may opt for some really shiny and fancy marketing solution when in truth, incrementality test, like a geo test or an A/B test, could actually be the way forward with it. So I think sometimes it doesn't really matter what size of businesses it is, these sort of core principles are not necessarily actioned or implemented.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I saw a post where you mentioned that you lost a client because you've made them self-sufficient. And I know in the past you spent time to clarify that Day One Data is a consultancy, not an agency, where you really have to focus on building product and tools in the customer's ecosystem to make sure that they have all required to then grow on their own. Can you share like a success story where, your work has significantly improved marketing outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason why we have that as part of our mission statement, is to give the IP to the client. What we found in, use cases at Tesco or even Farfetch is that, especially when it comes to the marketing domain, the actual marketeers don't implement or operationalize solutions where they don't understand it, right? Where there's a lack of trust. And then on the flip side, when you're trying to pitch a prospect, the thought or the factor that you're going to have to work with this consultancy or agency forever is a reason, the big blocker or barrier to entry. So what we're trying to do is to, remove all the friction from those two pain points. So one, build the IP for the company so that people do trust it. And two, upskill and train the internal teams so that we can make ourselves redundant within the process so they can sustainably grow and scale without day one data. And I think, to be honest with you, that's like quite a 2024 model due to, the amount of information that's available online, open source code. So setting up teams for long-term success is the mantra. In terms of a success story, can't necessarily mention who they are, but quite a typical problem that we face is companies want to reduce their marketing budget, but still have some kind of, ongoing presence, and they don't know where they should be reducing that budget on a sub-channel level or by how much. So what we typically do for these companies is, the optimum solution is a marketing mix model, which is like an econometric statistical model to really infer incrementality of marketing spend. And you can use that to forecast and scenario plan, i.e. what happens if I reduce my spend by half. But that's something in which is maybe slightly more reserved for bigger companies because of like the volume of spend which is required. However, what you can do in the absence of marketing mix modeling is doing display or PPC channel budget optimization models or budget forecasting models, which looks into historical spend and profit data or revenue data. And you use this blended with some seasonality, other business scenarios, and you form this view of diminishing returns, right? So you're seeing how much can that company spend to make the most amount of money possible before it gets to the point of no return. And, like the money they actually start to generate, so the ROAS, return on advertising spend, actually decreases proportionally. And what we did for this one client was to create these budget optimizer models, and we were able to reduce their spend by half, be a bit more intelligent or a lot more intelligent about where they're placing half of those funds and on a sub-channel level, and then actually saw returns of pretty much similar. Because what you often find is that companies are wasting advertising spend and they're not spending as efficiently as they could be. So that's one example of how we've basically helped a company to reduce their spend by half, but they still saw returns which are pretty much the same as before.
This is a really good example because there's a lot of, everyone is going for growth. Everyone's saying, VCs or every company is like, yes, we want to drive growth. And then it's like, what does that mean? I think a lot of people easily think about the spend that comes with that, to be like, we want to be doing marketing, we need to do advertising, we need to be everywhere at all times. And I see that it's kind of like an early big mistake. If you look at startups, one of the main things they're asking funds for VCs is always like marketing, because once we do this specific ad is going to drive the return. And I think actual return on investment for marketing is very different. So that's kind of what you're going into, to actually have to understand or have the right goals in place and the experiments in place and the tracking in place to measure those things, so then you make better decisions. So now we can go into most asked questions, because there's a few things now that you mentioned around growth marketing. How early should company think about the data they're capturing and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think depends on the type of business maybe, and it depends on what you have. So for example, even if you're not spending on marketing, but you have a SaaS platform, you probably want to invest money into some kind of user tracking solution so you can understand your features, right? Like a Mixpanel or Google Analytics, for example. And there's quite a lot of other solutions as well. So, you know, the core of like having a data setup doesn't necessarily mean some big fancy, you know, mature data warehouse. It can just be data visibility, right? You can just be using Excel files that maybe are attached to your ERP system, you know, so you understand like actually how much of something is really going on. So for me, it's all really about data transparency, not necessarily about maturity at that early stage. And yeah, likewise, as you mentioned, if you are attacking different problems like marketing, you know, you're going to need your GA set up correctly. You're going to need the right tags coming from a different like marketing channels that you may or may not be investing in. You're going to need to start to capture data, even if you go through non-performance-based marketing and you start doing events. Make sure you're writing down how much money you're spending on events or PR or communications, you know. So for me, data is such a broad word and doesn't necessarily need to be defined by having some crazy data lake or warehouse. You know, it can just start with setting things up in the right way, accounting for them within some kind of automated or even non-automated reporting system. Similarly, I know I mentioned industry by industry can change certain things. Like a good example is e-commerce, right? If you set up a Shopify shop on a new website, you know, nowadays there's tons of Shopify apps which you can use, like a Tripleware or a Analytics, and you know they can do your basic reporting for you. There's lots of obviously inefficiencies in their approach, but you know you could have data in your fingertips for probably not that much money per month. So yeah, to be honest with you, it's all about making agile decisions. You know, use the data that you can. You don't need to reinvent the wheel to begin with. It's just about giving you more power to validate your business objectives.
That's a really good point. So you're pretty much saying that to be, definitely before launching an MVP or when you're launching new features, data should be a part of the minimum requirements. I don't know if you've seen, but obviously in the past, we would launch things without the data. You'll be like, okay, well, how do you measure the success? And I think,
yeah,
hopefully that's changing because spending time to get the right tags in place is very, very important. So, and don't know if you want to talk a bit more about what are the what's the minimum viable data setup for an early stage startup?
To be honest with you, I think it's really hard to generalize, but to your point, you know, without the data, it's very hard to make business hypotheses. Without having the right data, it's very hard to prioritize your roadmap. You know, without having the right data, it's very hard to, as you mentioned, to a new feature and then test whether or not that thing was impactful or doing what you wanted it to do effectively. Each business is extremely different. If you create an AI company, maybe you need a completely different data set to someone who's selling some CPG via a Shopify store. So I think it's quite hard to generalize. But what I would say is, you know, the basic foundations of upstream data accuracy, from like tagging things correctly, storing things in a nice format within the upstream systems, making notes of things like product or campaign taxonomies, you know, that's what I would say is a good like 0 to 1 initiation. Is just, you don't need anything fancy, but do the minimums correct, right? And keep stores and notes and the right governance of certain things. Because one day when you do want to progress and come to a bit more of a substantially mature, you know, stat, for example, you're going to be pretty happy that you've made those inroads, because it doesn't matter how fancy your data warehouse is. If your upstream tagging and tracking and upstream sources are inaccurate, then your data warehouse is also going to have those same inefficiencies.
Yeah, and obviously a lot of analytics or a lot of decisions, you'll be basing them on historical data. So if you haven't tagged it properly you're pretty much wasting the opportunity in the future to be able to use this to understand how your customers have changed or who
Yeah.
are your most loyal customers. And I think there's a lot of questions that data really has strong answers to, especially for growing businesses. I think early on, definitely talk to your customers because they have the why behind it to really help. But as you grow, you'll get a lot more clarity from data. And because you mentioned around, the correct tagging, and it kind of sounds like a bit of a system in place of the right labeling. Who is expected to be doing that?
That's the age-old question. I think it can fall on, I mean, the luxury role is to have like a MarTech manager or person within the business, but typically that would fall on the marketing teams or in conjunction with like a marketing agency if you are working.
Okay. Because I used to get a lot of my engineers to do the tagging.
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways. There's like the actual tagging setup, which you might have to create on Google Tag Manager, and then there's the implementation, which would require some kind of engineer to support with. So it's definitely an intersection between like MarTech product and engineering.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. I guess that's where marketing is such a high knowledge base, isn't it? It's quite specific expertise you need to have. So definitely probably invest some time in trying to understand, or at least find the right experts to set those things up properly. Okay. And how do you know you've outgrown the GA stack?
I think if you've got a very omni-channel business, and you're doing like offline invoices and you sell wholesale to a retailer, but you also do sell some of your business D2C e-com, the GA is potentially only accounting for that D2C e-com piece, not for, the rest of the business value. So whilst it's a good driver of like a subsection of your customers, it might not be a great proxy for like everything else that's happening in your business.
What are the key metrics that are like really important to track?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is so business agnostic, but I'd say from our perspective, if you're not looking at things like CAC, LTV,
You want to
repurchase.
like expand those.
Okay, the CAC is the cost of acquiring a customer. LTV is lifetime value. ROAS is return on advertising spend. These are core drivers of, I guess, what makes a business tick, especially if you're looking at things from like a marketing or customer lens. And then repurchase rate, like are people purchasing again? What's your retention rate? Are you keeping them within the business? So these types of things, but again, very different to different businesses. If you have like super high technical business and your reliance on platform, you might looking into more, platform and reliability metrics. If you're looking into, like a manufacturing business, it might be something more around like lead times of products sold. I think all core businesses should care probably about like a small subsection of metrics in terms of like, profitability, LTV, CAC, ROAS, and they're quite good proxies, I guess, for like understanding the business health.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. So now it'll be really good to know about what are the biggest challenges when it comes to setting up the right data foundations, and how what's the right setup for companies to actually make strategic decisions on the back of the data.
Yeah. I think there's lots to unpack here. So, if we think about what are the challenges in setting up those foundations, obviously the most basic one is that the technical implementation can be a little bit tricky. If the business model is really complex, and I think I touched on this before, like if you've got omni-channel sales and purchase funnels, and you've got like a complex payback period or invoicing process, grouping together all of these different or disparate sources together to reduce silos and make one central view of the data can be a little bit tricky. But then, moreover, there's, I guess, parts of like the data setup which sometimes can be overlooked. For example, data governance, like documentation and data definitions, like the accuracy of the data, the actual quality of it, how these things are maintained for the long term. One of the core things which we always go on about is having data objectives aligned to business objectives. So you're obviously know about this as a product manager, but use cases. Don't just build something for the sake of it. Make sure that you're building something with purpose, with meaning, for a reason, with a value associated to it. Not just because it's the right thing to do, for example. And I think that's a good point of breaking down of like why you would or wouldn't invest in data. Data is an investment, not a cost to a business, because it's a pillar for growth, pillar for sustainable growth. And the way in which you can invest in data is not just by creating like a data lake, right? You could buy software, you could train a team, you could hire a team, you could onboard a consultancy. It's really varied in terms of how it works. But, what I would say is like, if data is a good decision for you, is like, if you want to assetize something in the business or platformize it, data is going to be a core driver. If you want to understand your customers better, if you want to create, bespoke custom solutions, have a single version of truth internally, all of these things together to help really like optimize how you grow to scale efficiently. I think those are really the reasons why you would invest in data. And it's because there's a return. To achieve your stated objectives with data, it's not just because necessarily you have the correct solution in place. There needs to be a culture of being data driven, right? And that could come through, a great driver of this is by having like a strong data strategy, right? Before you invest in data, is to invest in a data strategy, because that can help validate the business strategy and then map it out what data can support. That can improve data literacy. It can tell you what that ideal utopian architecture should be, or who you should hire, or how to organize teams to make sure they leverage data in the best way. It can help, map out the use cases and this potential value from, other industries or like internal ambitions or aims. So I think all of those things together are why sometimes data can be a challenge, but once it's phrased and delivered in the correct way within a meaningful data strategy, I think you see a lot of benefits. And one being like, it helps you basically prioritize your time, resources, and effort in a business, which is all about, scaling efficiently.
I like the fact that data is not a cost, is an investment in getting that right. It makes a lot of sense. And from early on, you should invest in having the visibility and accuracy of data. And then later, you'd be like, invest more to learn more, to optimize. So whatever the cost of getting the tools or the strategy in place will pay for itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think, it really highlighted the importance of getting data strategy right, and the levels of, the levels of data doesn't have to be as complex as everyone thinks. Or this is a good way to go into the myth buster, which is we can actually go through the topics of what do people tend to get wrong about the data foundations or marketing data.
Yeah. Where to begin? I think something which we actually learned at Tesco, which is always quite a good way of thinking about data, is as like supply and consumption, the supply and demand of data. And, when you're within a data team and you create maybe like the perfect contemporary bespoke data stack, that still doesn't mean that people will consume what you're necessarily offering. So I guess one myth to bust is, data is always an enabler and a driver for business change, right? It's not sometimes only enough to invest in the supply of data, but you need to invest in consumption. So that's how people can trust the data, can operationalize it, fostering a data-driven culture. So I think that's, one piece. Another one, I think we kind of touched on this in one of our original questions, but, like where to begin with data, how do you invest in data? Data can be anything. I think that's a myth. You can have like a really good data stack using Excel. It's not ideal. You can have these things. You can have a GA setup and just leverage that. Data is really, as I said, a transparent understanding of like a business point or a consumer point, which you can then use to create a hypothesis. So these foundations that you build don't need to take like 6-month big heavy projects. It can just be something really agile and tactical. And then, I think to the point that we've kind of touched on, data is really, it's an investment, not a cost. And if the mentality of it within a company is that it is a cost and not an investment, then you're kind of losing a battle before you've even reviewed.
I really like the supply and consumption, because I think maybe it is that companies that see it as a cost, they haven't actually got the consumption part of it to the right level, because translating data from its raw format, especially if you're like, let's say, your business has been around, you're scaling at speed, you maybe didn't invest in the right foundations, and you have a lot of data tech debt. So I think that's also something that is not always discussed, but if it's not set up in the right way, you need a lot of time to clean up, to get it to be accurate, to answer the business questions. So I see a lot of time companies that they don't have the right foundations from, back in the day. They're growing and they're like, okay, well, this investment in data hasn't worked out for us, and I'm just going to like leave it. Like any other cost is not going to provide a return on investment. But I think that's probably because they just don't know how to consume it, to translate it from the raw data into the questions or the business questions.
And this is why, you can almost think about a data delivery or a ship as a product, right? It's a data product, and likewise with a product, you don't just go and build the whole thing initially. You pick one small feature as an MVP or proof of concept with a small level of investment, see if it brings the value for, one particular granular thing. And then you need to decide you want to go all out. And that's something which, we'd always recommend to people. Start small and then go big once you're realizing some value.
Okay. Some like quick wins to showcase the value and get people to buy into it. Nice. I know this is around the myth section, but one thing you mentioned was around personalization. And I think maybe one myth is people's understanding how much personalization relies on a good data foundation. Don't know if you wanna, tell us more about that.
My experience of personalization is working with very big companies who require lots of data to implement their personalization strategies, right? So that's like consistent user tracking before they're logged in, when they are logged in, understanding them from a CRM perspective and also demand generation perspective, having very complicated promotional activity and also, front end of the actual platform, personalized features too. So distinct user experiences when they log in. So in those scenarios, there's a absolutely foundational, heavy reliance on data and tracking to be able to implement, these different propositions. However, if you don't have that level of data available, what customers or suppliers can do is to create segments, use and leverage like the basic information which you do have, create cohorts of these different customers, and then you can kind of aggregate your personalized approach. If you don't have, I guess like the technical implementation to do distinct user experiences for everyone, you can at least create like segmented campaigns, at least by email or marketing strategies.
Yeah, and that links to the myth of you need to have huge amount of data to personalize the experience, and you've proven that actually that's not the case. Personalization has loads of different layers. And I guess the action there is, it's the same with data, it's the same with personalization, is don't assume it's such a complex thing and like be like, okay, this doesn't apply to me, when actually if you break it down to the core of it, you can get value out of it at every stage. You don't have to wait for like
Yeah,
next thing.
exactly. I mean, it definitely should not lead to any anxieties, right? Like the reason why you invest in data is to make decision making and then subsequently life and business expansion easier, right? You know, that's the reason why you invest in data at its core. So, you know, sometimes like the remedy might be a little bit frustrating, but eventually, you know, it makes life a lot easier in the long run. But the reason why it may or may not be frustrating is sometimes just because of how things are upstream set up in the first instance.
Nice, I get it. So like data is the answer to a good night's sleep. I get it.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, to be fair, you made me think, because I started the business similar times. It's been now like 6 months and I'm not tracking anything. And then you mentioned, you should track your like open rate and, how many people are like signing up to newsletters, this and that. And I was like, you know what? Yeah, maybe just start with a spreadsheet. You're never too early, you're never too small to track data and create visibility.
This is not day one data advice, but I've personally tracked every message I've sent on LinkedIn or email or any conversation I've had via my own like Excel spreadsheet tracker.
And what insights have you, like, how did that make decision making better?
It helps with predictability, you know, at the end of the day. And that's crucial when you expand a business, because you want to know like, how many people, same as any B2B, I guess, sales role, which I'm no professional in whatsoever. But, you know, the more people who you do message, the more people are going to respond. But it's good to understand the ratio of how many people I need to message to get a meeting, how many of those people that I do have a meeting with lead to a discovery call, how many of the discovery calls lead to a proposal, how many of the proposals turn into a win, you know, a close. So the more predictability you have in any aspect of business, the better. And I don't think consulting should be any different.
It's a very powerful takeaway. I'm going to have to track back all my, maybe not.
Yeah.
You don't go back. I'll just go forward. And now we're at the final thing, where is around the threshold concept. And we kind of started to slowly touch on it, which is, what is the bare minimum information that someone needs to understand, to know, to understand the core of marketing data or data foundation?
I'm going to go for a slight cop out in my answer and say that, you know, my answer is maybe more, you need to understand why you need data or why you want data, you know, or why this marketing data is important before you invest time in it. You know, what I would say is that anything that you create or set up or deliver won't be maintained and kept or leveraged to its maximum potential if you don't know why you're doing it. And that's the same from setting up your Google Analytics in the right way. If you don't really appreciate what you're going to be doing with that, then there's no way that you will actually set it up in the correct way, or at least maintain it in the correct way forevermore. So my answer would be, yeah, very simply put, theoretically understand what you want to do with that data before you start doing it.
Yeah. And I think there's also that level of visibility. I really like this predictability, because data is like, helps you understand what you're currently doing to then be able to like sparkle new ideas, and then to be like, okay, because I know all of this, how would I make things differently? And I don't know if I'm going to keep this or not, but I remember that when I was reviewing my habits, I was like, look, I want to be a more productive person, or I want to change my habits. The first thing I did was track, where do I spend my time for a week? So be like, okay, well, from the moment I wake up to when I go to sleep, what are
Yeah.
the things that I do? And just knowing, where did I spend the time? Where was it wasted? It was like such a good, kind of mirror of, this is what you do. And I think maybe data is the one that provides like how you spend your time. You think very subjectively
Organization.
about it. Yeah, but it's a very subjective way of how you run your business. And data is that objective view of, this is what you think you're doing really well, but this is what's actually happening in reality. Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And we're now at the end of the podcast. There's been a lot of different takeaways. It's been really great to kind of really understand the core of data needs, and to really realize that you should really implement this for your use cases and be very clear on what you want to achieve, and then use data as an enabler, and don't make it too complicated to make, to give you anxiety. Just keep it simple, helping you answer your questions. So I really appreciated this. Do you have like a space, like if people wanted to reach out with further questions, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, definitely. The two best methods. Number one is to connect with me on LinkedIn. So Jake Barnett is my name. And second one is to go on dayonedata.co.uk. And there's plenty of areas to book a meeting or email me on.
Nice. Yeah, I'll add those as part of the podcast links as well to make it easier. But thank you so much for your time today, and for sharing so much of your knowledge on the topic. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.